In December 1989, amid the skin-cutting cold of Montana, snow fell so thick it turned the narrow roads around Bitterroot Valley into blurred white ribbons. The faint yellow light from the diner at the end of the street reflected off a thin layer of ice the moment Zoey Hawthorne ended her shift and stepped into the heavy night. Just minutes later, the darkness swallowed her as if she had never existed. Her footprints in the snow were wiped clean by the wind before anyone realized something was wrong. That night, Montana sank into a deadly silence. 4 years later, another girl, Amber Rhoads, vanished on a snow-dusted road, leaving only the sound of a large engine fading into the forest. Then came another name, Lila Santiago, 14 years old, disappeared right in front of her school before the sun had even set. 3 disappearances, 3 girls, 3 locations miles apart, but all revolving around Bitterroot. For years, the Montana community believed the cases were just tragic coincidences. But tiny clues, a piece of yellow plastic, strange tire tracks, ranger reports of faint lights deep in the woods, began to suggest something bigger, darker, and more organized than anyone wanted to believe. Over time, the scattered traces became bones in a skeleton not yet assembled. Then, one winter night, a witness no one expected emerged from the Bitterroot forest, shivering, exhausted, but carrying a story powerful enough to shake all of Ravalli County. From that point on, the investigation was no longer about finding missing girls. It turned into a hunt for a ghost who had lived among them for 8 years. Someone who knew how to hide, how to wait, and how to use the forest's very silence to cover his crimes. But this story is not just about 3 disappearances. It is a reminder of complacency, of ignored signals, and of the terrible price a community pays when it believes strange things will just go away on their own. We're going back to late 1980 Montana, where 3 girls walked into the deep cold night and never came home, and where a cabin hidden beneath the pines began to reveal secrets Montana had unknowingly lived alongside for more than a decade. Where are you reading this story from? Drop your location, because tonight, we're about to reopen one of the most mysterious cold cases in the American West, a story of disappearances, decades of silence, and the darkness that shrouded Bitterroot Valley for 13 years. Snow was starting to fall harder when Zoey Hawthorne pushed open the metal door of the diner on Highway 93 and stepped outside, her breath instantly turning to thin mist in front of her. Her shift had run longer than planned, because the last customers arrived late, and now both the diner and the stretch of road ahead were bathed in the weak yellow glow of a flickering street lamp. Zoey wrapped her scarf tighter, pulled her jacket zipper all the way up against the wind, and started walking toward the empty parking lot. She didn't have a car. She usually walked back to her rental, less than a mile away, a short stretch but lonely enough that others avoided it on winter nights. The snow under her boots crunched steadily, blending with the wind blowing in from the distant Bitterroot range. Behind her, inside the diner, the owner counting the day's cash looked up and watched her through the glass, as he always did. He was the last person to see Zoey's safe, small figure, quick steps, bright green scarf standing out against the white snow. The second street lamp on the entrance path had just gone out, plunging the stretch beyond the diner sign into deep darkness, where only a narrow trail led toward the sparse woods. Zoey kept walking, never pausing, completely unaware that somewhere out of sight a pickup truck had just turned off its headlights to avoid drawing attention. In the hours that followed, the wind picked up, snow fell thicker, and the road became empty, as if no one had ever walked it. By midnight, the owner locked up and realized Zoey hadn't texted that she was home safe, as she usually did. He tried calling her rental, but no one answered. When morning came, Zoey's neighbor knocked on her door. No unmade bed, no lights left on, her purse still in the corner. They thought she might have stayed at a friend's, but by noon, calls to the diner, to friends, and to family all confirmed no one knew where Zoey had gone after leaving work. Her family drove up from Missoula that same afternoon, retracing the familiar route she walked, but saw only snow-covered ground, nothing unusual except the strange emptiness of the road. Worry rising, they stopped at the local sheriff's station and reported Zoey missing, giving the exact time she left the diner, describing the green scarf and the direction she headed. Immediately after the missing person report was filed, the Ravalli County Sheriff's team, along with a handful of local volunteers, began retracing the route Zoey usually walked from the diner to her rental. Snow from the night before still lay thick, gusts of cold wind whipping low fog across the road, forcing the searchers to move slowly, step by step. They started at the diner parking lot, the last place she was seen, then followed the footpath down a dip and onto the narrow road that ran parallel to the edge of the forest. The first footprints they found belonged only to diner staff and early morning passers-by. Everything else was too jumbled to identify. Still, about 30 yards from the exit, one volunteer spotted a short line of small prints that seemed to match a woman's shoe size, heading along the trail before abruptly vanishing where wind had swept the snow clean. Though they couldn't confirm they were Zoey's, the team marked the spot as suspicious and widened their sweep. Deputies split into two groups. One followed the main road toward Zoey's rental, the other pushed into the tree line where thick clouds were already dimming the light. Snow-laden pine branches hung low, blocking sightlines and making any tracking harder. Yet, in the soft snow, one searcher found a single shoe lying on its side, next to a small tree. Color and size matched what the diner owner said Zoey usually wore, but the shoe was oddly clean. No signs of a struggle or a fall nearby. Deputies carefully bagged it as evidence and photographed the scene before fresh snow buried the area completely. They kept expanding the radius, following the direction the earlier prints seemed to point. But thick snow and strong wind erased marks fast. Within hours, whatever traces remained were gone. The little-traveled trail was now blank, fresh powder covering the old everything uniform. No drag marks, no scraps of fabric, no other personal items. Still, large tire tracks noted several dozen yards from the tree line suggested a vehicle may have stopped near where Zoey disappeared. Heavy snow, however, prevented identifying the type of vehicle or direction of travel. While one team combed the woods, another returned to the parking lot and diner area to look for witnesses and check for cameras, but in 1989, the diner had no security system, and the few scattered homes nearby saw nothing unusual beyond Zoey walking away the previous evening. No screams, no arguing, no signs of a struggle. Everything was too quiet, too clean, as if Zoey had simply melted into the dark without leaving anything behind. The search dragged on for 2 more days. They brought in tracking dogs and basic thermal scanners, but the cold made equipment unreliable. The vast pine forest and small ravines spilling into the Bitterroot made any search easy to scatter. Deputies flagged dozens of spots to recheck, but repeated visits turned up nothing new. Snow kept falling, erasing both old and new prints. Each return to the spot where the shoe was found revealed only flat, silent snow. By the end of the 4th day, after hours of continuous searching, deputies faced a hard truth. There was no clear evidence Zoey had an accident, was attacked, or left the area willingly. All they had was one shoe and a few wind-blurred footprints. No body, no struggle marks, no witnesses seeing a vehicle leave. They had to scale back the active search and move the case to pending further leads. Zoey's family, drained from stress, stayed camped near the forest, hoping one last sweep would find something missed. But as night fell and cold wind swept through, everyone had to pull back. The final daily report noted that no theory could yet be ruled out: voluntary disappearance, accident, or abduction, all still open. And though the search wasn't officially closed, the case remained frozen, quiet and vague, just like the snow-covered road where Zoey vanished. 4 years after Zoey Hawthorne vanished without a trace, life in Bitterroot Valley had slowly returned to normal, though the silence surrounding her case still made people uneasy now and then. In the summer of 1993, warm weather and long days made everyone more relaxed. especially teens whose gatherings often ran late. That evening, 16-year-old Amber Rhoads went to a small birthday party at a friend's house south of Missoula. The party wound down around 9, and Amber decided to walk home as usual. The route was familiar, just over a mile, mostly through a sparse residential area that wasn't completely isolated. The final stretch ran along the edge of the forest, the same general area Zoey had once walked, though no one mentioned that at the time. Amber left the porch with a light backpack and her Walkman clipped to her belt. Friends waved goodbye without worry. She often walked alone and was seen as tough and independent. A neighbor of the host saw her turn onto the side road, walking fast, apparently listening to music. That was the last time Amber was seen acting normally. As she moved deeper into the quieter section, house lights behind her faded, and the darkness of the forest ahead grew thicker. According to a driver who passed by around that time, he didn't see Amber, but remembered being blinded by the sudden bright headlights of a large vehicle stopped right where she had just walked. The light flared straight onto the road, forcing him to slow down. He couldn't identify the vehicle, only that it was bigger than a regular pickup. Farther back, a nearby couple heard the low heavy rumble of an engine, like an older truck or something built for hauling. When the sound faded, they heard no screams or scuffle, so no one thought to call police. When Amber didn't come home on time, her mother first assumed she was lingering at the party. By 11 p.m., the family contacted friends. Everyone confirmed Amber had left early. Panic rising, they drove the route themselves but found nothing. At midnight, they called the sheriff. Fear spread fast through the small community. No one wanted to bring up Zoey, but the similarities, a young girl walking at night, disappearing on a familiar road, made many feel something was wrong. Deputies arrived immediately at the last place Amber was seen. Flashlights swept the road and forest edge, but found no belongings or drag marks. The road surface was dry, and the ground on both sides was shaded by trees, leaving no clear prints. The only notable detail, the spot the witness described with the bright headlights, showed no skid marks, no dropped items, no signs of a struggle. The next morning, the search widened. A small piece of yellow plastic was found near the road's edge, but its origin was unclear. Tire tracks in the soft dirt indicated a heavy vehicle had stopped there overnight, but a brief early morning rain had blurred them. Volunteers who had searched for Zoey years earlier joined and noted the tread pattern, looked like something from a heavy-duty rig, yet they couldn't be sure. This area also saw logging trucks and construction vehicles. As teams swept the nearby woods, one volunteer recalled that back in 1989, when Zoey disappeared, they had once noticed faint light from a cabin deeper in the forest, but dismissed it as campers or hunters staying overnight. The detail was noted again, yet at the time, the cabin was just an odd footnote, not enough to link the two cases. In the 48 hours after Amber went missing, no significant evidence turned up. She didn't appear at any hospital, didn't contact friends, and no one saw her leave the area another way. Theories flew fast: accident in the woods, running away, hitching a ride with a stranger, but none fit the fact that Amber left no trace at all, especially just a few hundred yards after leaving the party. Police made no public connection to Zoey's case. There was no hard evidence to justify it. Two young women, disappearing on different roads 4 years apart, was treated as tragic coincidence, nothing more. The only shared clues were powerful headlights and the heavy engine of an unidentified vehicle. From that moment, the search for Amber entered the same frustrating phase as Zoey's: no witnesses, no traces, no clear direction. And once again, a young girl from Bitterroot Valley vanished into the night, leaving behind a bewildered family and an investigation starved for solid leads. Right from the first morning after Amber Rhoads was reported missing, Missoula police and local search teams deployed across the entire route she had walked the night before. Although the area was close to residential neighborhoods, parts of it were still darker and quieter than usual because of dense trees and widely spaced houses. Compared to the Zoey case 4 years earlier, this search was far more organized. One group swept the roadway, another went into the woods, and a third talked to residents along the route. At the spot where a witness had described seeing the lights of a large vehicle, searchers found the ground lightly disturbed, evidence that a vehicle may have stopped there overnight. There, they recovered a small piece of yellow plastic, possibly from a vehicle body or marker light. Though it wasn't distinctive enough to identify the type of vehicle, police collected it for further testing. On the road's edge, a large tire track was noted, but it was too faint and distorted for positive identification. Still, it differed from the tire patterns of typical family cars that used the area, so officers flagged it but couldn't draw conclusions. The search moved deeper into the fringe of the forest where light from the main road barely reached. They worked a grid pattern, checking every patch of ground, tree base and clump of brush, but found no personal items, footprints or anything that could be directly tied to Amber. The silence and lack of obvious traces reminded many volunteers of the Zoey search in 1989, though no one said it out loud. One volunteer who had also looked for Zoey paid particular attention to how clean the scene was, as if every potential clue had been erased before they arrived. Mid-morning, a volunteer standing on a rocky ledge looking deeper into the woods reported seeing a faint light flash for a few seconds, like a light from a small cabin. Police split off a team to check the location, but when they reached it they found only an old wooden cabin with the door closed and no signs of recent occupancy. Cabins in the area were common, many hunters or hikers might leave traces, so officers logged it as something to note but not a priority at the moment. The fact that the cabin sat on the edge of the Amber search area earned it just enough attention for coordinates to be recorded, but it didn't open any new investigative direction. By noon, teams expanded in both directions. One kept working the forest while another went door to door a second time, but they gathered almost no new information. A few residents said they'd heard a heavy engine the night before but couldn't pin down the time or type of vehicle. Others noticed nothing unusual. No witness had seen Amber herself, after the point where she turned onto the side road, and no one saw her leave the road in a vehicle or head deeper into the woods. In the afternoon, searchers returned to the tire track area for a closer look. By then the ground had been trampled by many feet, and a light morning rain had made the remaining marks even harder to read. The yellow plastic fragment found nearby led police to consider that a large vehicle might have stopped due to some kind of problem, but it could just as easily have been a construction truck or a Forest Service vehicle. Every possibility existed, yet none was strong enough to steer the investigation down a specific path. The search continued into the evening of the second day, but yielded no further signs. No purse, no shoes, no torn clothing, no personal belongings of Amber's were left behind. Once again, the scene looked either deliberately concealed, or as if no struggle had ever taken place. Amber seemed to have vanished from the road suddenly, silently, and cleanly, a fact that worried police deeply, but gave them nothing solid to act on. When night fell, police had to scale back the search because of lack of natural light and no fresh tracks to follow. Amber's family lingered in the area, hoping the teams might find something at the last minute, but all they got was continuing silence. Like Zoey 4 years earlier, every trace around Amber's case quickly slipped into ambiguity, forcing police to admit they had no clear direction left. The search was suspended, leaving an unanswered question about what had happened on the familiar road Amber walked every day. The search for Amber Rhoads stretched into a third day with no clear signs, forcing police to shift focus to her personal background, the same approach they took with other missing teen cases. The yellow plastic fragment, the faint tire track, and a few statements about headlights or a heavy engine were all too vague to form a specific investigative path. As a result, Amber's case was quickly treated as standalone, with no official link to Zoey's disappearance 4 years earlier. Police started with the familiar theory: Amber might have run away. It was an easy assumption, especially for a teenage girl going through a school change and new friends. Yet everyone close to her insisted there were no signs of distress, and she hadn't taken clothes, money, Idaho, or anything needed to leave home. She left no note or message. That theory quickly weakened, though it remained a remote possibility in the reports. When investigators examined her relationships, they found no conflicts or disputes. Friends and teachers described Amber as easygoing and not involved in arguments. Anyone who might have been considered a potential suspect had solid alibis for the night she vanished. Nothing pointed back to Amber's own life, and that line of inquiry soon hit a brick wall. Meanwhile, false rumors began spreading through the community. Someone claimed to have seen Amber with a strange man. Another swore they heard screaming near the woods. One person even mistook a girl in a similar jacket, riding in a truck going the opposite direction. Police followed up on every tip, but none included specific times or reliable descriptions. Most were just rumors that diluted rather than helped the investigation. Police also considered whether the large vehicles seen in the area might be connected. But that stretch of road in summer regularly saw logging trucks, construction vehicles, and campers. No witness could provide a license plate or accurate description, and there were no surveillance cameras to review. The faint tire track only proved a heavy vehicle had stopped at some point. It couldn't be timed or tied directly to the case. The yellow plastic piece wasn't distinctive enough to trace, and was kept only as secondary evidence. Some residents began asking whether Amber's disappearance could be related to Zoey's in 1989. Police, however, found no strong common threads. Zoey vanished in winter on a snow-covered, more remote stretch. Amber disappeared in summer on a road near homes, under completely different lighting and weather conditions. Age, timing, travel circumstances, and even the type of evidence didn't line up. At that point, police had to treat the two cases as separate incidents with insufficient data to link them into a series. After a week with no progress, the search was scaled back to a small team that would respond only to new tips. Day after day, nothing surfaced. Amber wasn't seen at hospitals, there were no financial transactions, no one reported encountering her on the road, and no physical evidence suggested she had left the area in another direction. The investigation settled into the exact same pattern as Zoey's: a young woman gone from a familiar road, no direct witnesses, no clear physical evidence, no specific leads. For both police and family, the most frightening part wasn't what they found, it was the total emptiness surrounding the case. Once again, Bitterroot Valley faced a mysterious disappearance, and this time they didn't even have a starting point to follow. 4 years after Amber's case went cold, Bitterroot Valley entered 1997, hoping the strange events of the past would not repeat. Yet in early September the third disappearance struck, this time 14-year-old Lila Santiago, a diligent girl who rarely walked alone after dark. That day she had attended an afternoon language class at the Missoula Community Center. Since both parents were tied up at work, they agreed she would walk a short distance to the main intersection to be picked up, something the family had done many times without issue. Class ended after sunset. Lila said goodbye to her teacher, hugged her books to her chest, and stepped out of the glow of the light pole in front of the center. A teacher was the last person to see her in the busy area. From there Lila walked the short familiar route to the intersection where her father planned to stop. The first part of the path was well lit, but it grew darker as it neared the pickup point. A student walking some distance behind remembered a silver-gray pickup, traveling slowly in the same direction as Lila. He didn't think much of it, except that the truck noticeably slowed when it got close to her. It was an older model with a slightly dented tailgate, but that type of truck was extremely common in the area, so it didn't raise immediate alarm. When the student turned down a different street, that was the last anyone saw Lila walking normally. Around the time Lila should have reached the intersection, a woman who lived nearby heard a truck door slam hard. She looked out through her curtains and saw only the glow of a vehicle's lights shining back down the road before it drove off quickly. There was no scream or sign of disturbance. To her it was just the familiar sound of pickups stopping to collect kids from evening classes. Lila's father arrived about 10 minutes late, assuming his daughter was still waiting. When he didn't see her, he drove back to the community center, where the teacher confirmed Lila had left on time. He immediately returned to the intersection, but the area was empty. After several loops around the neighborhood with no sign of her, he called his wife, and then reported her missing to police. The case was taken seriously right away because Lila was a minor, and the time window was narrow. Police sealed off the intersection, and swept both sides of the road with flashlights. A few small footprints were found in the dusty shoulder, but they were too faint to determine direction or owner. When searchers pushed into the nearby tree line, they recovered a short length of thin nylon cord caught and broken on a low branch. The item was collected, but DNA testing limitations at the time meant its forensic value couldn't yet be determined. Another piece of evidence was a vocabulary worksheet blown a few meters from the pickup point. There was no way to know whether Lila dropped it while walking, or if it had blown out of her books. Beyond that, no backpack, jacket, textbooks, or any of her belongings turned up in the area. The ground showed no clear signs of a struggle. If force was used, it happened fast and clean. Just like the previous two cases, while sweeping deeper into the woods, one volunteer mentioned he'd heard of an old cabin in that vicinity from past hunting trips. But cabins in the Bitterroot forest were so common there was no specific reason to suspect a connection. Still, the detail was noted in the report under locations to verify if additional evidence emerges. By midnight the search had expanded to side roads around the intersection, but no new physical evidence or useful witnesses surfaced. Most residents confirmed they hadn't seen any girl walking at that hour except Lila leaving the center. A few mentioned hearing a heavy engine, but nothing specific enough to identify the vehicle. The next day the search continued through the areas around the pickup point, pine woods, and possible turnoffs Lila might have taken. Nothing new was found. The faint footprints from the night before had been erased by wind. Every effort ran into the same invisible wall experienced in the prior cases. What alarmed police most was the speed of Lila's disappearance. The distance from the center to the intersection was only a few hundred yards, and the gap between when she left class and when her father arrived was just minutes. That window was far too short for her to have willingly walked much farther, or left the area on her own. Yet there was no evidence she had been forced into a vehicle, or taken into the woods. Inside the investigation team, some wanted to compare Lila's case to the earlier two, but once again nothing was strong enough to justify it. The disappearances happened in different seasons, involved different suspected vehicles, occurred in different locations, and the victims were different ages. 3 cases spread across 8 years on 3 unconnected roads made any serial connection look like speculation. When the sun set on the second day of searching, police had to admit a 14-year-old girl had vanished in the space of minutes on a road with regular traffic and left no trace. With Lila, Bitterroot Valley once again faced the terrifying silence of a third unsolved disappearance in less than a decade. Right from the morning after Lila Santiago was reported missing, Missoula police and volunteers quickly gathered at the intersection where her father was waiting to pick her up, the exact spot where she vanished in just a few minutes. This was a sparsely populated residential area, but by no means remote, so the fact that a 14-year-old girl could disappear without anyone seeing anything immediately sparked alarm. Yet, just like the 2 previous disappearances, the scene offered very few concrete clues to follow. At the edge of the road near the meeting point, searchers found a few small shoe prints, but they were all too faint and scattered to be positively identified as Lila's. They blended with the footprints of earlier pedestrians and led nowhere specific. Still, their presence was one of the rare details in an area that was otherwise almost empty of physical evidence. In low bushes a few meters off the roadway, a volunteer discovered a torn beige fabric scrap caught on a branch. The fabric was thin and lightweight, very similar to the material of a child's jacket. Lila's mother confirmed her daughter had been wearing a jacket of a similar color, though the fragment was too small to say for certain it was hers. The piece was collected and became one of the most notable leads in the early stages of the search. Not far away, another team found several long strands of hair caught on peeling tree bark. The color and length matched the description of Lila's hair, but because of strong winds the previous evening, no one could be sure whether the hairs had been pulled out in a struggle or simply blown there from someone else. The strands were collected for analysis, though DNA testing at the time was not advanced enough to yield fast or conclusive results. Near the tree line, the ground showed tire tracks that were clearer than anything found in the amber case. The impressions were deep, with distinct tread patterns, but they belonged to a common type of tire typically found on older pickup trucks. There were no skid marks or unusual tire patterns, so there was no way to determine whether the vehicle had stopped there at the exact moment Lila disappeared or had simply passed through before or after. When the search expanded along the entire route, Lila had walked from the community center. No personal belongings of hers were found, no backpack, no books, no pens, no discarded jacket. The only item was a single vocabulary worksheet that had blown into the area near the intersection, but there was no way to confirm it was hers or whether it had drifted there from somewhere else. There were no signs of a struggle, no disturbed soil. The scene was unusually clean, a characteristic that matched both previous cases. Another group of officers pushed deeper into the woods after a volunteer mentioned an old hunter's cabin in the area. When they reached it, the small cabin was locked and showed no fresh footprints. Inside there was no furniture or signs of recent occupancy. Police noted the cabin, but did not treat it as a primary point of interest, because nothing indicated Lila had ever been there. As the day wore on, many on the search team began to realize that the repeating element in all three cases, the rapid disappearance and near total absence of traces, was becoming impossible to ignore. Yet officially linking the three required solid evidence, and all they had were scattered fragments, a questionable fabric scrap, hairs that could belong to anyone, tire tracks that were far too common, and footprints too faint to matter. None of it carried enough legal weight to conclude the cases shared a single perpetrator. By afternoon, with no new leads, police began scaling back the active search. They rechecked trails, side roads, and the forest edge, but found nothing more. Every significant piece of potential evidence was confined to a small radius around the intersection, and even those only hinted, never formed a logical chain. By the end of the day, police had to admit that despite recovering more physical items than in the previous two cases, they still could not establish a clear connection between the traces and Lila's disappearance. The investigation settled into a familiar pattern, a young female vanishing quickly, over a short distance, unseen, unheard, and leaving no clear trail. And just like the two cases before it, Lila's, despite causing greater panic because of her young age, was still treated as an isolated incident. 3 disappearances spanning 8 years, 3 different scenes, and still no evidence strong enough to tie them together into a series. Of course the unease in the community grew, but on paper, everything remained separate, each case its own open question. When the search for Lila Santiago was officially scaled back at the end of 1997, police in Ravalli and Missoula counties were forced to re-evaluate all 3 disappearances over the previous 8 years. Despite increasingly large-scale searches with each new case, the outcome was always the same: no traces, no reliable witnesses, no clear investigative direction. Lila became the 3rd victim to vanish from a familiar stretch of road without leaving any verifiable evidence, leaving investigators facing complete deadlock. In the debriefings after Lila's case, police considered whether the 3 incidents might be connected, but when details were compared, everything pointed to them being independent events. Zoey disappeared in winter on a dark road near the forest. Amber vanished in summer near a residential area. Lila disappeared in early fall on a short route between school and an intersection. The victims were different ages, the weather conditions varied, the locations differed, and the physical evidence in each case was not specific enough to form a consistent pattern. Even the small traces found in Lila's case, the torn fabric, the hairs on bark, the tire tracks, carried no weight sufficient to link the three incidents. They were all common items that could match hundreds of people or vehicles in the area. Investigative agencies at the time also lacked advanced DNA technology, had tiny databases, and almost no ability to analyze trace evidence, like cells on rope fibers or individual hairs. No specific suspect, no direct witnesses, no reference samples for comparison. The three most critical elements in criminal investigation were all missing. So when Lila's file was finalized in early 1998, police decided to move all three cases, Zoey Hawthorne, Amber Rhoads, and Lila Santiago, into cold case status. This was standard procedure for missing persons cases with no remaining leads that could no longer be actively worked. The files were not fully closed, but they would only be reopened if new evidence or information emerged. Notably, the three cases were not stored together. Zoey's was classified as missing, unknown circumstances. Amber's as missing juvenile, and Lila's as high risk due to victim age. That meant each file sat in a separate drawer in different locations, with no indication they might be related or should be studied side by side. This classification unintentionally prevented police from seeing the bigger picture, that all three had occurred within the narrow confines of the same valley. In the months immediately after they went cold, occasional calls still came in from the public claiming sightings of one of the three girls in other towns. Every tip was checked, but none panned out. No one had news of Zoey. There was no sign of Amber, and there was no evidence Lila had ever left the Missoula area. Within the department, a few older investigators still remembered the cases, but they had no data to pursue. Any point of interest, even the abandoned cabin once mentioned, was never treated as a real threat without direct evidence. Every attempt to connect the three cases was rejected for lack of legal grounds and modern analytical methods. In the end, 1998 closed with three files placed in three separate drawers, gathering dust. To law enforcement, they were simply three unrelated disappearances that did not meet the criteria for a serial crime. But to the Bitterroot Valley community, the prolonged silence of the three cases left a lingering unease, and no one realized that the very separation of the files would keep the truth buried for many more years. 4 years after the disappearances of Zoey, Amber, and Lila were shelved as cold cases and stored in three different drawers, Bitterroot Valley had slowly come to regard them as tragic, unsolved stories. Law enforcement no longer had resources to revisit old files. But in 2002, a seemingly minor detail started everything moving again, from an abandoned cabin deep in the Bitterroot forest that had been briefly mentioned during the Amber search, but dismissed for lack of connection. In May, during a routine patrol, Forest Ranger Curtis Bradley noticed something odd. An old wooden cabin he had passed dozens of times, always dark and empty, now had a faint light seeping through the door crack. The light was not the steady beam of a flashlight or camping lantern he was used to. It flickered softly, as if a weak source was being intermittently blocked. Bradley didn't immediately think anything serious. People sometimes camped, hunted, or used the forest temporarily. What caught his attention more were fresh tire tracks in the soft dirt near the cabin. The tracks were deep, and came in from a direction that was not an established trail, as if a vehicle had driven straight with the trees to reach the cabin and then left the same way, behavior not typical of hunters. When Bradley got closer, he saw the door had been reinforced with a new wooden brace, its color and finish completely different from the weathered frame. Someone had clearly worked on the cabin recently. On his way back to the patrol station, Bradley stopped again because he heard a faint metallic sound coming from the direction of the cabin. The noise lasted only a few seconds, and then stopped, enough for him to note it in his report. Bradley mentioned that this same cabin had been brought up in 1993, when a volunteer reported seeing a faint light during the search for Amber. But at the time no one followed up, assuming it was just campers. In the report to his superiors, Bradley recommended the cabin be monitored further, because the combination of light, noise, and tire tracks made it no longer look like a typical abandoned structure. However, since there were no clear signs of criminal activity, the suggestion was only noted for the record. A week later, when he returned to the same patrol route, the cabin still had light, this time clearer and steadier. A dim yellow glow leaked through the door crack, resembling an old incandescent bulb or oil lamp rather than modern flashlights. This was even stranger because in 2002 most campers used modern lights and did not stay long-term in such a remote part of the forest. Bradley filed a second report, noting signs of regular use. This time his superiors forwarded the information to local police for a joint check. When the report reached the Raleigh County Sheriff's Office, an older officer vaguely recalled the cabin being mentioned during the Amber investigation, though it had never become an official lead. 2 deputies were sent to check the cabin. When they arrived, the light was gone, and the cabin appeared completely silent. However, the tire tracks Bradley described were still visible, though lightly dusted over. They knocked, no answer. They walked around the structure, and noticed the back door was secured with a large, fairly new padlock, completely out of place against the old hinges. That detail made them linger and observe longer. Still, there were no signs of crime, no strange smells, no discarded items, no sounds, no presence of anyone. Without probable cause, they could not force entry. The deputies took a few photos, documented the current state, and reported the cabin as a location to monitor if further reports come from ranger services or the public. The cabin was overlooked again, just as it had been in 1993, but this time it was officially entered into the record. A copy of the report was sent to the Cold Case Unit as standard archiving procedure. For the first time in years, the cabin's name reappeared on paper connected to the 3 missing girls, even though no one at the time thought it was actually related to what had happened over the previous decade. None of the officers at that moment knew that this seemingly harmless cabin was the source of the metallic sounds Bradley had heard, the concealed light he had glimpsed through the cracks, and the tire tracks leading to something no one had suspected for 8 years. But in 2002, the cabin was still only a vague point of interest, one of dozens of old structures scattered throughout the Bitterroot forest. All the same, it had resurfaced, been documented in a report, and placed in the same storage area as the 3 earlier cold case files. A small coincidence, but one that would eventually become the critical knot tying together 3 disappearances that had seemed unconnected for 8 long years. Following repeated reports from Ranger Curtis Bradley about dim lights and unusual tire tracks near an abandoned cabin in the Bitterroot Forest, the Raleigh County Sheriff's Office decided to send a patrol unit to inspect the site in person. Although there was still no clear evidence of criminal activity, the recurring suspicious details, flashing lights, faint metallic sounds, a door repaired with fresh lumber, and tire tracks leading from an area with no trail meant the cabin could no longer be dismissed as it had been in 1993. When the 2 deputies arrived, the cabin emerged among thick stands of pine, old and weathered, yet showing several details that didn't match its supposedly abandoned state. First were the wide, deep tire tracks, still fairly sharp despite a light dusting of dry soil. Strangest of all, their direction didn't line up with any normal forest access road. They came straight out of dense underbrush, indicating the vehicle had driven through terrain never meant for wheels. They approached the cabin and followed standard procedure, loud verbal commands, ordering anyone inside to come out. No response. When they knocked, the wood gave back a dry, heavy thud with no movement from within. Flashlights shone through door cracks revealed nothing but total darkness, no glow, no silhouettes. Upon closer inspection of the front door, one deputy noticed the frame around the lock had been reinforced with new wood, still lighter in color than the sun-bleached, silvered boards of the rest of the cabin. Replacing lumber on an abandoned structure was highly irregular, but without legal grounds to force entry, they had to continue checking the exterior. Moving around back, they discovered a heavy-duty metal padlock, newly installed on the rear door. The hinges, by contrast, were old and rusted through, creating a stark contrast, as if the cabin were deliberately patched in specific spots. Still, with no signs of property damage or imminent danger, the site could not yet be treated as an active crime scene. The patrol continued sweeping the surrounding area. They found a few faint boot prints in the dry dirt, but nothing clear enough to date or direction. No trash, no campfire remnants, no cooking gear. Everything around the cabin was clean yet lacked the feeling of complete abandonment, creating an unsettling contradiction. One deputy suggested checking east of the cabin, where the tire tracks appeared to head. But only a few dozen yards later, the tracks vanished entirely. The dense forest made further tracking hopeless, no unusual sounds except wind and branches scraping together. After photographing the cabin, front door, rear padlock, and tire tracks, the deputies concluded their visit and returned to headquarters. Their report stated the cabin might be in unauthorized use, but provided no basis for stronger action. They recommended placing it on the routine patrol watch list for future forest sweeps. The report was forwarded to the cold case unit, and one veteran deputy immediately recognized the cabin as the vague flicker of light mentioned during the 1993 Amber search, never taken seriously at the time. Now, with these new details, the location was flagged again on the map, this time with a clearer, low-level alert. From 2002 onward, the cabin was no longer just another nameless spot in the wilderness. It became a minor point of interest, not enough to launch a full investigation, but enough to keep on law enforcement's radar. No one realized it yet, but this was the first step toward pulling them back to something forgotten for 8 years, and it would soon become a critical link in reopening 3 seemingly hopeless cold cases. After the cabin was placed under periodic watch, no one knew that, while deputies still stood outside observing, the person inside remained imprisoned. And right when the perpetrator began growing careless, one small oversight appeared, becoming the first crack in a truth hidden for nearly a decade. The cell was actually a small storage room behind the cabin, separated by a rough wooden wall and secured with a homemade lock. For years the abductor had always checked everything carefully before leaving. But the old cabin wood was rotting, hinges deteriorating, and one time, possibly after hearing noises outside, he rushed away and failed to close the inner door fully. A hair-thin strip of light appeared along the bottom edge of the wall. That was what the longest-held victim noticed first. She had lived in near total darkness, distinguishing day from night only by temperature shifts and wind through the cracks. When she saw that faint glow, something that had never existed before, she knew something at the cabin had changed. She ran her fingers along the wood and felt it softer, more rotten than before. A tiny shift, but to someone imprisoned for years, it was momentous. The child living with her saw the light too. To the child, the cabin was the entire world. Darkness was normal. The sudden appearance of even a sliver of light sparked endless questions. In an innocent yet heavy voice, the child asked, "Is it daytime outside? How long have I been here?" She couldn't answer. Time for her was only cycles of winter cold and summer heat. But the child had grown little by little, and that alone said everything. They had been captive far too long. The strip of light appeared irregularly. Some days the abductor closed the door tight, and the light vanished. Other days he was hurried and left a gap large enough for them to glimpse the outside world. Dry ground, pine needles, sometimes the shadow of his boots passing by. In those moments, the woman began listening more intently to everything around the cabin. She noticed distant engine sounds, low, steady, recurring on a schedule. She memorized the sound of the vehicle door closing, his heavy footsteps, and how long he was gone. She realized he was staying away longer than in the early years. Silent stretches lasted much longer now. The child heard things she could not. It described stronger wind sometimes, or something like a car coming close then stopping. Those fragmented descriptions made her understand the child had been here long enough to know the cabin's normal sounds and recognize anything unusual. Then one day the child said something that sent chills down her spine, I think that man has been here a really long time, longer than me." That innocent statement revealed a crucial truth. The cabin had been in use before the child arrived, which meant the perpetrator might have been active far longer than when she herself was brought here. The tiny strip of light, caused by one careless door closing, became their tool to realize this wasn't a temporary hideout, but a fixed location the killer had used for years. If light could get in, it also meant someone outside might see something unusual, or at least notice the place wasn't truly abandoned. For the woman, it was the first spark of hope after years of only darkness. Not because she could escape immediately, but because she now knew this place truly existed, in a fixed spot deep in the Bitterroot forest, not some nameless void no one would ever find. And someday, if that strip of light appeared again, maybe someone out there would see something too. The sliver of light the killer had unintentionally allowed in recent months did not just give the longest-held woman hope, it gave her a chance to test something she had never dared consider for years: finding a structural weakness in her cell. As light filtered in on days the inner door was misaligned, she could see the rotten wood around the lower hinge, softened over time by the cabin's dampness. From then on, whenever the abductor was gone longer than usual, she began gently pushing. At first there was only a faint click, no real movement, but she kept trying. Every time she heard his vehicle leave, and the forest fell into thick silence, she pressed and twisted the rotten section, feeling fibers separate under pressure. The child stood beside her, both scared and curious, whispering, "Can we open it?" She signaled for silence, and continued. One night, when the cabin shook in strong wind and the first seasonal rain began pouring, the already rotten hinge weakened further. She used the steady rain noise to mask her efforts. This time the wood shifted noticeably. A small crack ran along the frame. She held her breath, careful not to make loud noise. The child clutched her hand, sensing something was truly changing. Then on an evening when she believed, based on his recent longer absences, he would be gone for hours, she decided to try one final push. She gathered every bit of remaining strength, and pressed hard against the rotten spot. The hinge popped halfway out with a dry snap, muffled by the rain. With one more forceful shove, the last piece of wood gave way completely, creating a narrow opening, just wide enough to squeeze through. She wasted no time. She lifted the child, lowered him to the cabin floor first, then crawled out after. When her bare feet touched free cabin floorboards for the first time in years, cold wind through her thin clothes made her whole body shiver, not from cold, but from finally being outside those four prison walls. But they weren't safe yet. The cabin still sat deep in the vast Bitterroot wilderness, and she had no idea which way to go. Her only guides were sounds she remembered through the light slit: vehicle noise usually from the east, a distant stream to the north. She chose the opposite direction, from where she thought the abductor appeared. The child clung to her, small feet caked in dirt, trembling from cold and fear. They moved through the night, struggling over layers of pine needles, fallen branches, and low rocks. Every forest sound, owls, snapping twigs, made them flinch. But they kept going. Returning to the cabin meant returning to endless darkness. After nearly an hour of stumbling by instinct, she spotted a corrugated metal roof glinting faintly in the moonlight ahead. It wasn't their cabin, it was an old hunter's cabin rangers sometimes checked. Though also abandoned, to her it was proof they had left the most isolated zone. She pounded on the door and called out, but no answer. Still, she found a clearer trail nearby, far more defined than anything she'd crossed in the deep woods. She guided the child along that trail. About 30 minutes later, they saw warm lights from a log house near the forest edge. She banged on the door relentlessly, nearly collapsing. The homeowners, an elderly couple, opened and stepped back in shock at the sight. A gaunt woman with matted hair, and torn clothes, and a pale shaking child. After a few stunned seconds, they rushed the pair inside, wrapped them in blankets, and called 911. When deputies arrived, the woman could not tell a coherent story. Her voice broke, words came in fragments and whispers, but what she managed to say froze every officer in the room. Cabin, deep in the woods. He kept us a long time. There are 2 more still inside. They pressed for the location, but she didn't know exactly. She could only describe a log cabin, 2 doors, new lock, dim light. When she mentioned new lock on the back door, one deputy immediately looked at another. That was the exact detail from Ranger Bradley's reports. For the first time in nearly a decade, they had direct testimony from a victim, details matching a site, long suspected but never thoroughly searched. Within an hour, the Bitterroot forest was swarming with patrol vehicles, search helicopters with spotlights, and rescue teams. The cabin was no longer just a watch list point. It had become the center of a rescue operation, and a manhunt for a criminal they hadn't realized they'd missed for years. Immediately after receiving the fragmented but extremely critical statement from the escaped woman, Ravalli County Sheriff's deputies escalated the information to the state level. Within 1 hour, Montana SWAT was mobilized and, in coordination with local police, completely sealed off the Bitterroot forest. For the first time in nearly a decade, they had a specific suspect location, and for the first time they knew there was a living victim who needed immediate rescue. The command team set up their operational map inside a log house near where the 2 victims had just been found. All available information was quickly compiled: satellite imagery, topographic maps, old Ranger patrol data, and especially photographs of the cabin taken by police several months earlier. When compared with the woman's description, fresh lumber reinforcing the front door, a large padlock on the back, and an interior layout with a small room offset to one side, only one cabin matched perfectly. SWAT used aerial photos to determine the safest approach routes. The cabin sat in dense pine, but there was a small clearing to the west large enough for the assault team to reach it without being detected. They marked the trail the suspect regularly used for entry and exit, based on tire track direction in the Ranger reports, and planned to set a blocking team there to prevent escape. While building the cabin model on the operations board, a crucial detail emerged. Based on window placement, roof angle, and shadow patterns, the analysis team realized the cabin had an anomalous area, space behind the main wall that was not visible in photos taken from the front entrance. That hidden space matched exactly the survivor's description of the back holding room where she and the child had been kept. The SWAT commander made the call: rescue the victims first, neutralize the suspect second. Any delay if he was inside and detected the encirclement could put the remaining victim in immediate danger. The force was divided into 4 teams. Team Approach A, move in from the west, close on the front door. Team Approach B, circle to the rear, breach the padlocked door, and go straight to the suspected holding room. Team Blocking, set up hard containment on the east side Forest Road, the route the suspect normally used. Team Scout, monitor the cabin with thermal optics from a safe distance. Just before the go order, scouts reported the cabin showed a heat source inside, weak but steady. Someone was definitely in there, most likely the victim. Worse, they detected no large movement, so they could not confirm whether the suspect was present or had just left. The entry order was given at 3:12 a.m., when the forest was pitch black and the wind almost still. SWAT moved in silenced boots from 3 directions, forming a tight ring. The front team reached the weathered wooden doorframe. The rear team arrived at the exact spot with the new padlock reported in 2002, 3:14. Team B set a manual breach tool to minimize noise, but the moment they prepared to force the door, the elevated scout saw a large heat signature moving near the front door. The suspect was definitely inside. The commander instantly adjusted. Team A would create a diversion with a hard knock on the front door. Team B would breach the rear simultaneously and reach the holding room as fast as possible. 3:15, Team A knocked 3 times, loud. Inside, the sound of a chair scraping and heavy footsteps moving toward the front. 3 hours 15 minutes and 10 seconds. Team B hit the rear door with a single decisive ram. The wood splintered exactly at the new padlock. The moment they entered, they saw the crude partition, the exact holding room described. From behind the wall came a faint sound, like someone jolting upright in terror. The operators pried the partition with a crowbar. The wooden wall collapsed, revealing two people, a thin young woman with wild, terrified eyes, a small girl clinging to her, shaking violently. The team leader confirmed by description: Zoey Hawthorne, missing since 1989, Lila Santiago, missing since 1997, and the child, identity still unknown, possibly the daughter of one of them or a third victim. The rescue element wrapped both in blankets, carried them out, and handed them to the waiting medical team deeper in the trees. Meanwhile, Team A confronted the suspect. He appeared at the front door holding a crude metal tool, not quite a weapon, but capable of serious injury. When he saw silhouettes through the gap, he bolted toward the rear of the cabin, straight into the path. Team B had just breached. He burst out the back but never had time to realize the route was blocked. Two operators took him down hard from the left. No shots fired, he was cuffed and controlled in seconds. As the handcuffs clicked, he stared back at the cabin and muttered incoherent words, as if he still couldn't accept that the place he had hidden in for years had finally been found. 3:20 a.m., radio call, 2 victims safe, suspect in custody. The encirclement was over in minutes, but it was the culmination of nearly 10 years of disappearances, 8 years of cold cases, and hundreds of wasted investigative hours. 3 victims were finally carried out of that forest, 1 who had saved herself and her child, 2 who were rescued, and an entire Montana community, now forced to face the horrific truth that had just been uncovered. Immediately after the rescue, the cabin was fully sealed, and became the most important crime scene in nearly a decade of investigation. Under portable floodlights set up around the site, the Montana forensic team, Ravalli County deputies, and the FBI began examining every plank, every speck of dust in the place where the 3 missing women were believed to have spent years in captivity. They started with the rear holding room. The space SWAT had torn open to free Zoey and Lila. Under ultraviolet light, stains bloomed across the walls and dirt floor, skin cells, scratch marks, clumps of yanked-out hair, and faint blood smears in the corners. Everything indicated long-term, not temporary use. The team carefully collected individual hairs, long brown strands, consistent with Zoey aging over the years, a few short blonde ones, matching Amber's 1993 description, and finer ones belonging to Lila. These samples proved the cabin had not held just one person. It had housed victims at different times over many years. That was quickly reinforced when they discovered a series of shoe impressions in the packed dirt. One very small child's print lay under thick dust, showing the little girl had lived there since she was tiny, not just the last few months. Faint drag marks ran from the holding room to the rear wall, believed to be from victims being restrained or moved while struggling. While examining nails in the walls, technicians recovered tiny fabric fibers caught on the heads. 3 distinct types appeared: old acrylic weave like 1980s winter clothing, possibly Zoey's beige cotton nylon blend, matching the scrap collected when Lila vanished, and pale yellow polyester, consistent with the jacket Amber wore the night she disappeared. Those fibers had snagged over years, creating a timeline of prolonged captivity. When technicians reconstructed the cabin's evolution using satellite photos from 1992, 1995, and 2002, a major discovery surfaced. The original 1992 cabin had no rear extension. By around 1995, the roofline had been lengthened, and the ground showed signs of rough concrete reinforcement. The holding room where Zoey and Lila were just found was that exact addition. It lined up perfectly with statements that the suspect modified the cabin as needed, especially after Amber, proving long-term planning and structural changes timed to his crimes. Inside the main cabin, forensic investigators found direct evidence linking the disappearances: a broken red plastic bracelet under the table, later confirmed as the one Zoey wore in 1989. A piece of yellow plastic stuck under a table leg identical to the fragment found at Amber's scene. A pair of tiny, nearly rotted shoes, fitting the rescued child, and a rusty tin cup with child bite marks. DNA matching the little girl. The front door showed clear signs of repeated forceful pushing or resistance over years. The inner wood surface was scratched with skin cells, and even held faint fingerprints belonging to Amber, preserved by the dry forest climate. This was the strongest evidence yet tying Amber to the cabin, since her case had previously lacked any clear crime scene. The floor held more buried evidence under layers of accumulated pine needles. When the team carefully excavated, they uncovered rotted paracord, homemade restraints, old metal jar lids, and a rubber cord with skin cells. These items showed the cabin had been equipped with different restraint tools at different times. In one corner, technicians located a coil of paracord identical to the sample recovered at Lila's 1997 disappearance site. The first-time evidence from that scene directly matched something inside the cabin. Under an old cabinet, they found stacks of old newspapers and woodworking books, proof the suspect taught himself to replace hinges, reinforce doors, and build partitions. One of the most chilling discoveries was a torn notebook hidden beneath a floorboard. The pages were not dated, just scattered notes. Change lock after, no light must escape, helicopter noise, night, front door rotting. These entries matched perfectly with the 2002 Ranger report about faint light and a new padlock. When the search extended to the yard behind the cabin, more shallow buried items appeared: old front door lumber, rotted restraints, and unidentifiable metal pieces. One item was sent for lab analysis, a tiny red fabric scrap buried near a tree root. Preliminary tests showed it was children's coat material from the late 1980s. Consistent with Zoey, the initial forensic results painted a clear picture. The cabin was not merely connected, it was the center of the entire series of abductions. Every wall, every layer of dirt, every object carried traces of the three victims. There was no longer any doubt, Zoey had been there from the earliest days. Amber had been held before the extension was built. Lila was imprisoned after the reinforced holding room was added. For the first time, investigators had a complete picture. One perpetrator, using the same cabin for 8 years, abducting and holding victims in cycles, remodeling the structure as needed, extending captivity time, then reusing it repeatedly, while leaving no traces at the external scenes. As the physical evidence formed an airtight chain, no one could deny the cabin was the key. And from that cabin, every answer the Montana community had waited nearly 10 years for would finally begin to emerge. Starting with the interrogation of the man who had kept this horrific secret for an entire decade. When the cabin forensic report was presented, Ravalli County detectives did something they had never done in 8 years. They put all 3 missing persons files on the same table. Zoey Hawthorne, 1989, Amber Rhoads, 1993, and Lila Santiago, 1997, 3 cases previously treated as unrelated, were now examined as parts of a single larger series. The moment they plotted the timelines on a single board, a clear pattern jumped out: exactly 4 years between each abduction. In the past, that regular gap had convinced investigators the crimes could not be the work of one person, but the cabin changed everything. They now realized the 4-year cycle was not coincidence, it was behavioral. The time the perpetrator needed to change jobs, vehicles, and prepare for the next abduction. When they overlaid the timeline with the suspect's personal history, a terrifying match appeared. 1989. He worked as a mechanic near Missoula, driving through the Bitterroot forest daily. 1993. He drove a materials delivery truck, regularly entering the southern forest area. 1997. He worked freelance, spending days at a time deep in the woods. No one had ever cross-referenced his work schedule with the disappearances, until now. Next came the vehicles. Records that had never lined up before now connected perfectly. Zoey case witnesses described a high-fronted truck with bright headlights reflecting off snow. Amber case, loud engine noise, yellow plastic fragment from an older truck body. Lila case, a silver-gray pickup driving slowly behind her. When investigators pulled the suspect's vehicle registration history, they were stunned. He had owned exactly those 3 vehicles, in exact chronological order. An old green truck in the late 1980s, a faded yellow truck in the early 1990s, and a silver-gray pickup in the late 1990s. He had even sold or abandoned each truck immediately after the corresponding abduction, creating the illusion that 3 different vehicles belonged to 3 different people. When the 3 abduction sites were plotted on one map, the most critical point became obvious. The cabin sat at the dead center of a 20-mile radius, the optimal distance for the suspect to grab a victim and disappear into the forest without drawing attention. Zoey taken from the north, Amber from the east, Lila from the west. The 3 points formed an almost perfect arc around the cabin, an unmistakable pattern. Every piece of evidence recovered from the cabin reinforced the connection. The yellow plastic fragment from Amber's case matched the piece stuck under the cabin table. Yellow polyester fibers in the cabin matched Amber's jacket. Old acrylic fabric matched Zoey's clothing. Cotton nylon fibers matched the scrap found near Lila's scene. Amber's faint fingerprints on the cabin door. DNA from Zoey, Amber and Lila, all present in the holding room. Satellite and construction analysis confirmed the cabin had no rear room in 1992 photos, but the extension appeared around 1995, 2 years after Amber, and 2 years before Lila. The perpetrator had literally upgraded the cabin for longer-term captivity, and the holding room was built specifically for that purpose. One veteran investigator reopened a 1993 volunteer report about flickering light deep in the forest that had been dismissed. That light was now confirmed to be the cabin, at the exact coordinates police had surrounded in 2002. At the end of the briefing, the lead investigator ordered the 3 scene maps, the captivity timeline, and the suspect's personal file hung side by side. When everything was on the wall together, the picture was undeniable. Same perpetrator, same operating area, same central cabin, same 4-year cycle, same vehicle pattern, and every victim left traces in the cabin at their respective stages. For 8 years the 3 cases had appeared isolated. Now they revealed themselves as overlapping layers of one repeated criminal behavior, hidden only by the long gaps in time, and because the cabin had never been properly investigated. When the meeting ended, no one still called them 3 separate disappearances. For the first time they called it what it actually was, one single crime series, spanning 8 years, revolving around one cabin and one lone perpetrator. After the cabin was confirmed as the center of the entire missing persons chain, the perpetrator was transferred to a special interrogation room at the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office. The investigation team was fully prepared. They knew he would deny everything, but for the first time in 8 years, they had enough physical evidence to dismantle every lie he told. From the very first question, the suspect remained ice cold, leaning back in his chair as if none of it concerned him. "I don't know anything about that cabin. I never met those girls. Whatever's in the woods isn't mine." The interrogation team calmly let him finish. They had prepared layers of evidence. They began showing photos of the cabin taken during the SWAT raid, the back door with a brand new lock identical to one found in his garage, along with the 2002 purchase receipt. The suspect only shrugged. "A lot of people use that kind." Next photo, tire tracks around the cabin. Forensic reports confirmed the tread pattern matched exactly the tires on the silver-gray pickup he was driving when arrested. He said, "I hunt. Everyone goes into the woods." Then the investigator placed the first evidence bag on the table, a piece of yellow plastic. "It matches the vehicle you drove in 1993, the investigator said. He blinked. His face changed for a split second, then repeated the familiar line, "Don't remember." Next, the investigator placed a torn notebook on the table. Inside was scrawled handwriting, "No light must get out." In the corner of the page was a faint fingerprint. Forensics confirmed it was his. "I don't know what that is," he replied, but his voice lacked confidence. The team began reading the escaped woman's statement, describing the exact layout of the captivity room: wooden walls deliberately misaligned, hinges that creaked when opened, the back door always double-locked, the smell of machine oil on the captor, the sound of a vehicle turning off the east trail into the woods. Every detail matched the real cabin. When the investigator mentioned the machine oil smell, they produced a cloth from the cabin stained with oil identical to the type he kept in his garage. He glanced at the cloth, then turned away. Then came the accounts from Zoey and Lila, the two rescued survivors. Zoey remembered the outer room door creaking. Forensics had recorded that exact sound inside the cabin. Lila remembered the dragging sound when she was forced into the room. Forensics found drag marks under the dust in exactly the spot she described. When the investigator mentioned the child, the interrogation room went dead silent. The child grew up in the cabin. He never knew daylight. He said the man came and went with the familiar engine sound. He remembers your truck. For the first time the suspect looked straight at the investigator. He said nothing, but his face drained of color. The team continued. DNA from all three victims was found on the walls, the cabin floor and the captivity room door. Amber's faint fingerprints were on the front door. Fabric from Lila's clothes, acrylic fibers from Zoey's clothing, and polyester from Amber's jacket were all recovered inside the cabin. They placed each evidence bag on the table like hammer blows against his denials. But the heaviest blow came when they showed satellite images from 1992, 1995, 2002. 1992, the cabin had no back room. 1995, the captivity room had been added. 1997, Lila disappeared. You built the captivity room 2 years before you took Lila, the investigator said. It wasn't me. Then who built it? The suspect did not answer. The question froze him, his hands unconsciously clenched. At the end of the session, the investigator opened the vehicle records. The high-profile truck he owned in 1989 matched the description in Zoey's case. The yellow truck in 1993 matched Amber's yellow plastic fragment. The silver-gray pickup in 1997 matched the witness description in Lila's case. They added a map showing a 20-mile radius around the cabin. All three abduction locations fell neatly inside it. When the full picture was laid out, the investigator delivered the closing line. You don't have to confess, the cabin already spoke for you. The suspect didn't scream or slam the table like many cornered killers. He just sat back in the chair, eyes dark, like a man who finally realized every layer of disguise he'd worn for 8 years had collapsed in a single night. The interrogation ended without a confession, but no one on the investigation team doubted him for another second. Every denial had been crushed, not by words, but by physical evidence, DNA, and the testimony of the survivors from the very room he believed would never be discovered. The case entered the phase the entire state of Montana followed closely. After nearly a decade of mystery, the Bitterroot Valley community finally saw the perpetrator brought to justice. The trial was held at the Raleigh County District Courthouse in the largest courtroom, reserved only for the state's most serious cases. Hundreds of residents arrived early, media lined up outside the main doors, and extra security was stationed throughout the corridors. From the very first day, the prosecutor opened with a statement that silenced the room. We will prove the defendant didn't just abduct, he imprisoned, psychologically tortured, and destroyed the youth of 3 girls for nearly 8 years, and the cabin is the irrefutable witness. The prosecution presented everything in strict chronological order. Zoey's case in 1989, Amber's in 1993, Lila's in 1997, leading up to the 2002 rescue. Each timeline marker was projected on a large screen, accompanied by diagrams of the cabin and the 1995 expansion of the captivity room. They began with forensic testimony. 3 forensic experts took the stand, detailing every sample collected from the cabin. Zoey's DNA on the inside of the wooden door, Amber's DNA on the captivity room wall, Lila's DNA on the dirt floor, the child's DNA on a tin cup and shoes. Hair, skin cells and scratch marks were separated by time layers, proving the cabin held victims at different periods. One expert explained, "There is no way these three individuals left matching DNA in the cabin unless they were held there. The dust layers and trace timing are consistent." The prosecution then showed the satellite images from 1992, 1995, 2002, pinpointing exactly when the cabin was expanded. The new captivity room was central to the argument. 1992, the cabin had only one room. 1995, an extension appeared at the back. After 1997, the captivity room walls showed long-term use marks. The prosecutor emphasized, the defendant built this room to continue his crimes. The expansion was not random. It happened right between the first two abductions. The second part of the trial revolved around vehicles. The defendant's three vehicles, a green truck, a yellow truck, and a silver-gray pickup, were presented to the jury through photos, registration records, and tire tread evidence. The prosecutor concluded, 1989, Zoey was taken by the high-profile green truck. 1993, the yellow plastic fragment from the cabin matched his yellow truck. 1997, witnesses saw a silver-gray pickup following Lila, the exact model he owned at the time. All three vehicles were different, yet all belonged to the defendant. The most powerful part was the victim's testimony. To protect them, the court set up a one-way screen, so they would not have to face the defendant directly. But their voices alone shook the courtroom. Zoey, the longest held, took the stand thin but with steady eyes. She described the snowy night in 1989, headlights, the door flying open, the sound of a crowbar on snow, then total darkness. She spoke of the cabin's machine oil smell, the old wooden door that always creaked, and how she eventually recognized the defendant's heavy breathing when he entered. The prosecutor asked, "Did you ever see his face?" Zoey answered, "Not at first, but after years, I knew the voice. It's his voice." The entire courtroom turned toward the defendant. He kept his head down, no reaction. Amber was no longer alive to testify, but the prosecutor read her final statement, recorded while she was still alive, preserved by her family, describing the yellow jacket and her last walk home, corroborated by matching physical evidence from the cabin. Lila, abducted at 14, recounted being dragged into the cabin, locked in the newly built room, and the years spent imprisoned with the child. She precisely described the double-locked back door, the misaligned walls, and the distinctive sound of the defendant's silver-gray pickup. She said the line that choked the jury, "I thought the smell of pine dust was the smell of the outside world. Turns out it was just the smell of the prison." Finally, the child, now about 8 years old, testified via pre-recorded video. Police did not want the child to face the defendant in person. The child spoke haltingly but clearly. "The man, he told me to stay quiet. He drove a big gray truck. It made a clunk-clunk sound at the back." Forensics confirmed the defendant's silver-gray pickup had a dent in the tailgate that produced exactly that sound. When it was the defense's turn, the defendant's attorney tried to claim the cabin could have been used by someone else, that the victim's memories were unreliable, or that the scene had been contaminated before forensics arrived. The prosecution immediately demolished every argument with irrefutable chains of evidence. The defendant's DNA on the cabin notebook, victim DNA on the cabin door, wear patterns on the lock-matching keys found in his home, his boot prints outside the captivity room door, 3 cabin expansion dates matching the 3 abduction periods. The prosecutor closed by saying, "Not a single piece of evidence in that cabin can be explained away from the defendant, but hundreds of pieces from the cabin explain away every word he has ever said." The jury took only 3 hours to reach a verdict. When they returned, the 4 persons stood and read, "We find the defendant guilty on all charges: kidnapping, false imprisonment, severe abuse, and intentional permanent harm to the victims." The judge sentenced, "The defendant is sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for each victim, 2 consecutive life sentences per victim. Total 3 consecutive life sentences, no possibility of reduction." In the courtroom there were no cheers, only sighs, tears, and visible relief. Zoey hugged Lila. The child was gently led out by victim support staff. The perpetrator was escorted away without a word. No one looked at him. Every eye was on the 3 survivors, who had lived through years of darkness. The trial ended, but for Montana, it was only the beginning of healing a community, where one small cabin in the Bitterroot Forest had hidden the truth for 8 years that no one suspected. After the no-parole life sentences were handed down, the cabin in the Bitterroot Forest, the center of 13 years of mystery, no longer had any reason to stand. Forensics had collected all evidence, performed a full 3D scan of the scene, and photographed every plank of wood for permanent records. But the cabin, with everything it represented, could not remain silently in the woods like a haunting shadow. 1 month after the trial, Montana's Forest Service, working with police, entered the area, removed temporary barriers, and began demolishing the cabin. They took off the roof, the walls, and finally the back captivity room, the addition built in 1995, that had held Zoey, Amber, Lila, and the child for years. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood that tearing down the cabin was not just clearing a crime scene, it was returning peace to the forest, and closing a dark chapter for the Bitterroot Valley community. Within weeks, grass and plants swallowed the clearing, and the place where the nightmare cabin once stood became just another patch of green blending into the forest. At the same time, the Raleigh County Sheriff's Office completed final paperwork, closing the longest cold case in county history. 3 once separate files, Zoey Hawthorne, 1989, Amber Rhoads, 1993, Lila Santiago, 1997, were now merged into one massive case file thousands of pages thick. At the closing announcement, the sheriff said, "We are not closing it because we forgot. We are closing it because the truth has finally been told." The file included the 8-year abduction timeline, photos of the cabin through its phases, the captivity room layout, DNA evidence, victim statements, and the 1993 and 2002 Forest Service reports. Reports once dismissed, but ultimately the key pieces that broke the case. Montana media quickly added the case to the state's most notable cold case resolutions. Investigative shows, podcasts, and criminology magazines all cited it as a textbook example of combining modern forensic techniques with relentless detective work. The Bitterroot cabin became a symbol that the smallest details, a faint light in the woods, tire tracks in dry dust, or a tiny scrap of fabric, can unlock a decades-long mystery. The Bitterroot Valley community slowly healed. Residents erected a small memorial in Missoula, with 3 plaques, bearing the victims' names, and the words, "Found, rescued, never forgotten." Families and locals often stopped by to leave flowers, a reminder that years of silence were not the end, but the start of their journey past trauma. The 3 surviving victims were moved to long-term psychological support centers. The child, the only person born in the cabin's darkness, was adopted by a family far from media attention. Their lives could never be normal again, but at least they had a chance to start over. When the file was officially sealed, Montana law enforcement held an internal debrief. What they took away was not pride in solving a tough case, but a lesson. A cold case is not a failure, it is a reminder that every piece of data matters, and what is overlooked today may be the key tomorrow. A faint light in the woods in 1993, a new lock in 2002, a scrap of fabric, a tire track, a faint fingerprint, all once considered minor details, until they were connected and became the keys to solving a 13-year case. In the end, the Bitterroot case didn't just close a cold case, it set a new standard. Investigations must be persistent, meticulous, and never underestimate any trace, no matter how small. In today's United States, the story of Zoey, Amber, Lila, and the child born inside a cabin, deep in the Bitterroot Forest, is not just a chilling crime tale, it is a very real reminder of community responsibility, the power of small details, and the importance of faith in the justice system. Ranger Bradley, twice reporting a strange cabin with faint light, a new lock, and tire tracks, coming from a direction with no trail. The beige fabric scrap at Lila's scene, the yellow plastic piece in Amber's case, once treated as isolated details, much like in modern American life, when people easily ignore things that feel a little off. A child repeatedly absent from school, a neighbor hearing constant yelling and crashing sounds, a strange vehicle parked near a daycare every afternoon. The lesson is not to live in fear, but to learn responsible awareness. Call it in when something feels wrong. Document it. Don't assume it's probably nothing. The way police once kept the 3 cases separate and unrelated. The story also shows the power of technology and persistence. It was the cabin forensics, DNA, on wooden walls, tire tracks, and vehicle timelines that broke the case. Just as today, in the U.S., doorbell cameras, phone data, and digital records can become lifesavers if the community cooperates and shares information. Finally, the Montana community, building a memorial for Zoey, Amber and Lila, reminds us that victims are not just news, they are daughters, students, neighbors, and respecting victims, refusing to blame them, supporting their therapy and reintegration, must become a cultural reflex. In a large, busy society, like the United States, the deepest lesson from the Bitterroot case is no detail is too small, no voice is meaningless, and community safety begins when each person chooses not to look away. Thank you for following this haunting yet powerful story of persistence and justice to the end. If it meant something to you, please subscribe to join us for the next case files. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring crimes revealed by the smallest details that can change an entire community.